Troy Carter had always believed that machines were easier to fix than people. An engine misfires, find the leak, replace the gasket. A broken axle? Weld it back strong as new, but hearts, hopes, he'd learned long ago that those were better left alone. Yet here he was, standing in the doorway of his drafty, oil-scented workshop as a billionaire's SUV rolled to a stop just beyond the faded Carter Auto Repair sign. The black Cadillac Escalade looked painfully out of place next to rusted pickup trucks and dented Hondas waiting their turn for his tired hands. Troy wiped his hands on a rag that should have been thrown out years ago. He didn't expect rich folks here. His reputation was local. Honest, stubborn, cheap if you didn't mind waiting. The SUV's door opened and a woman stepped out. Her heels sank slightly into the gravel as she bent back into the car to lift out a tiny girl bundled in a pink blanket. He recognized her immediately, Eleanor Westwood. Everyone in Illinois knew the Westwood name. Real estate, tech startups, charity galas where a single dinner ticket cost more than Troy made in a month. But up close, Eleanor didn't look like a cover story. She looked tired, hair pulled into a loose knot, makeup nearly washed away by worry. She balanced her daughter on her hip and met Troy's eyes across the drive. The girl clung to her mother's coat collar, her legs stiff inside heavy braces that made her look smaller than she was. Troy stepped forward before he knew why. Maybe it was the little girl's eyes, wide and searching, or maybe it was the way Eleanor's shoulders sagged, as if she'd carried the world on her back for far too long. "Mr. Carter?" Her voice cracked like it hadn't spoken softer than boardroom commands in years. "They told me you might help. I didn't know where else to go." Troy didn't answer right away. Instead, he held the door wider and gestured them in. Inside, the garage smelled of metal and last night's cold coffee. Leela, that's what Eleanor called her daughter, stared at the dusty shelf of old car parts as Eleanor lowered her onto a battered rolling stool. The girl's braces clicked against the metal as she tried to settle in. "Doctors said she'd never walk," Eleanor said after a long silence, her eyes darting around as if the clutter offended her perfectly curated life. "They said her muscles were too weak, her bones too delicate. I've tried everything. Money. It doesn't fix this." Troy knelt in front of Lila, who flinched at first. He didn't speak to her like people usually did. No fake baby voice, no pity in his eyes, just a gentle smile. He pointed at her braces. "Mind if I take a look?" Lila nodded. Her tiny fingers gripped her mother's hand so tightly Eleanor winced. Troy's calloused fingers worked carefully, tracing the metal rods and leather straps. They were top of the line, probably cost more than his whole garage, but they were wrong, too rigid, heavy, built for show, not for a child trying to stand on her own feet. "I can make her something better," Troy said quietly. He didn't know what made him so sure, maybe because he'd spent years welding together parts no one believed could fit. Maybe because the girl's hopeful eyes had done what no paycheck ever had, made him want to fix something more than just metal. Eleanor blinked fast, fighting tears she hated showing the world. "I can pay, whatever it takes." Troy stood and wiped his hands again, though they were still clean from the inspection. "This ain't about money, it's about time, and her trusting me enough to try." Eleanor dropped her gaze to the oil-stained floor. The billionaire facade slipped a little more. She nodded. "We trust you." Over the next hour, Troy cleared a corner of his garage that hadn't seen daylight in years. He pushed aside old mufflers, rusty toolboxes, and an ancient drill press. He brought out scrap aluminum rods, motorcycle shock absorbers, soft padding from car seats, bits and pieces that didn't look like much until they came alive in his hands. Lila watched him work, her head tilting every time he measured something against her tiny legs. Eleanor sat in a folding chair, sipping burnt coffee from a paper cup Troy found behind a toolbox. She couldn't stop watching this man, this tired, broke mechanic who hadn't asked for a down payment, who spoke more kindly to her daughter than any surgeon ever had. She'd built skyscrapers and bought companies on nothing but instinct, but standing in Troy's garage, all she could do was hope she'd bet on the right stranger this time. When Troy caught Lila's eyes drifting shut, He gently laid a folded blanket over her lap. "Big work starts tomorrow, little one," he whispered. "Tonight, you dream about taking your mama for a walk in the park." Eleanor's throat tightened. For the first time in years, she let herself believe in something that wasn't a contract or a treatment plan. She believed in a man with tired eyes and magic in his hands. Outside, the wind rattled the garage door, but inside, the only sound was her daughter's soft breathing, mingling with the scratch of pencil on paper as Troy sketched the impossible into something that just might work. By the time dawn broke over the sleepy Illinois town, Troy's garage looked like an inventor's lab from another era. Scraps of polished aluminum, coiled springs, bolts, and sheets of soft leather scattered over every workbench. Troy hadn't slept all night. He didn't care. He'd measured and remeasured Lila's tiny legs, sketched diagrams by hand on the back of old receipts, and reworked the design at least a dozen times. Eleanor dozed in a corner chair, her arms wrapped protectively around her daughter, who slept curled up on a pile of old wool blankets. When she woke to the rattle of Troy's welding torch sparking to life again, she blinked against the harsh light, momentarily forgetting where she was. Then she saw Lila's little shoe peeking out from beneath the blanket and remembered she wasn't in some luxury hospital suite with marble floors and hush-voiced doctors. She was in a cluttered garage, trusting a stranger with rough hands and kind eyes. Troy finally set down the torch, wiping sweat and grime from his forehead with the back of his hand. The first brace gleamed softly in the dim light. Not factory perfect, but lighter, better balanced, flexible where it needed to be. He looked at Eleanor with a small, proud smile. "Want to see if she'll try it?" he asked. Eleanor's heart thumped against her ribs. Carefully, she nudged Lila awake. The little girl blinked up at her mother, then at Troy, who knelt beside her and held up the new brace as if it were a secret treasure just for her. "Can I show you something special, Lila?" Troy asked. Lila nodded, sleepy but curious. Eleanor lifted her daughter onto Troy's workbench, cleaned off just for this moment. Troy's big hands worked with astonishing gentleness, removing the stiff, heavy medical braces and slipping on the new ones. The straps fit snug but didn't bite into her skin. The rods flexed slightly when Lila wiggled her toes. "All right, sweetheart," Troy murmured. "Can you try to stand for me?" The girl hesitated, clutching Eleanor's hand. For years, every time she'd tried, pain and frustration had followed. Eleanor stroked her daughter's hair. "It's okay, baby. I'm right here." Lila took a breath and shifted her weight. The braces held, balancing just enough to take her tiny, trembling legs. She lifted herself up an inch, then two, her eyes wide with surprise and concentration. Eleanor felt her own breath stop in her chest as Lila's feet settled flat and stayed there. For the first time ever, her daughter was standing on her own, even if just for a heartbeat. Troy swallowed hard. He'd fixed transmissions that should have been scrapped, rebuilt entire trucks with fewer parts than a modern car door. But this, seeing that kid push herself upright, it filled some empty corner of him he hadn't realized was there. A week passed like that. Eleanor and Lila arriving at dawn, staying until dusk. Troy turned one corner of the garage into a makeshift rehab space. He found two old parallel bars from a scrapyard and sanded them smooth, anchoring them to the floor. Between oil changes and brake jobs, he adjusted Lila's braces, tightening here, loosening there, always tweaking for comfort and balance. Sometimes Eleanor caught him mumbling to himself, "Too stiff on the left." She leans when she tries to pivot, as if he were tuning a classic engine, not helping a child's body learn to trust itself. It wasn't easy. Lila fell more than once, frustration turning her soft cries into quiet sobs. Eleanor's instinct was to scoop her up, to tell her it was okay to stop, but Troy always shook his head, gently. If she wants to try again, she tries again. Let her decide. And every time Lila did. She'd push herself up, braces humming softly, tiny muscles working harder than they ever had. She learned to take a single step, then two, then three, with her hands clutching the bars. Each night, Eleanor would carry her sleeping daughter back to the Cadillac, her heart swelling with cautious hope she hadn't felt in years. Word spread around town. People driving by Troy's shop at dusk could see the lights still on, the little girl practicing steps between the bars, her mother wiping tears while Troy jotted down measurements and sketched new tweaks by lamplight. One evening, Eleanor brought him coffee, real coffee, not the burnt sludge he drank by the gallon. They sat on the front step as Lila slept inside, exhausted but safe. "Why are you doing this?" Eleanor asked suddenly. "You could charge me triple. You could sell this design to some medical company." Troy shrugged, staring out at the dark road. "Because she wants to walk. Because maybe I needed something worth fixing that isn't metal for once." When the day came that Lila took 5 unbroken steps alone, the little garage filled with quiet sobs. Eleanor fell to her knees beside her daughter, hugging her tight, while Lila giggled in surprise at her own courage. Troy turned away, pretending to look for a wrench that didn't exist. He didn't trust his voice not to crack if he tried to say a word. Afterward, Eleanor pulled out her checkbook, but Troy held up his grease-streaked hand. "Spend it on her. Get her the therapy, the checkups, whatever she needs. I'll be here if she needs another brace." When they left that evening, the old pickup truck sat silent in the dark, tools rattling softly in the back as Troy leaned against the garage door. For once, the tired mechanic didn't feel so tired. He watched the taillights fade, knowing tomorrow he'd wake up and do it all again. Not because he had to, but because sometimes broken things were worth fixing, especially when they weren't things at all.